We're part of support services, the same as a self-regulation team, and we have behaviour support coaches and senior educators across the state, and we also have our special educators as well who kind of play in this space. So some of the misconceptions are that if there's a behaviour referral, it's for a particular child for therapy around the behaviour. That's not the case. That's not what we do. We're there to provide support, information, adjustments for the school and the education setting to support your kids. So it might come through as an individual referral for your child, and they'll seek your permission for that, where we might then carry out some observations, conduct a bit of a functional behaviour analysis, that sort of work, or we might meet you guys in directions, conferences, planning meetings, that kind of thing. But it's certainly not that individual therapy. So I just wanted to really clarify that first. You might also see the behaviour coaches or special educators in your kids' class in terms of a teacher referral. So sometimes the teachers of your children will refer and say, I need support with how to manage this group as a whole cohort. We've got lots of different needs in this classroom. How do I differentiate for all of them in my class? Or we might even have a whole year level referral, or we might even be helping the school implement, say, a whole new behaviour or wellbeing sort of policy, or a positive behaviour learning kind of framework. So we're going to talk to today a bit how the Behaviour Support Toolkit, which looks like this. Has anyone seen one of these or no? So we've got two of our copies today. There's two kind of different formats of them that we'll pass around for you to have a bit of a look at while we speak to that as well. And I understand you've already done an acknowledgement of country this morning, but we also would like to acknowledge that the lands that we meet on is the lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay respects to them. So this is the toolkit. It was published in late 2020, and it's designed for our education leaders and teachers and behaviour support coaches, support services to use when we're kind of mapping out behaviours developmentally versus perhaps what might be concerning. So all school leaders should have got a copy of this. So, they're not hard to miss, really. They're quite large. So if you go into a leadership office, you should see one of these. All the wellbeing leaders also receive them in the schools at their wellbeing leaders days, and your support services staff will have them as well. So if you look through, and again, we'll pass this around, it kind of goes through what might be developmentally appropriate as opposed to then when we get to the other end of the continuum about when it might become a behaviour of concern. It's also, I suppose, there to help our staff review and monitor what they're doing with your kids and the interventions and adjustments that they're providing, and also as a really common language or tool to be able to work collaboratively in that team around the child. So we don't like to always see behaviour as that negative end of the scale. So this does acknowledge the really positive behaviours and those inclusive, respectful behaviours, but then it goes through all the way across that continuum and over to our complex, I suppose, and unsafe behaviours, which we call behaviours of concern in here. So it does take into account our understanding of all the other things that the child or young person brings in this space, so all the complexities, any diagnosis that are there, their kind of family and environmental setting, the school context, and at times at that kind of tier 3 we call it, so that pointy end, so it won't happen for every child. There's probably a functional behaviour analysis that's been taken place with the behaviour coach. So this one here is a bit of a summary, I suppose, of how we look at the behaviours, and I'm thinking that maybe with the OTs you kind of talked to perhaps some of we came in at the tail end, those sensory seeking behaviours and the avoidant kind of behaviours. So we look at the behaviours in that context, and then of course the internalised, so what's going on inside the child, as well as those externalising behaviours to kind of map where they're sitting. I'll let you talk to the categories, and I'll pass this one around maybe from this side.
Thanks so much, Katie. One of the core parts of this work as well, particularly in regard to the behaviour categories, is to make sure that we've got consistent language across schools so that, as we've said before, if a student moves from one school to another, we define, an anxious behaviour or a sensory behaviour in the same way so that for that young person, they have consistent responses from the adults in their lives, which is really important in helping students to navigate their behaviours so that they know what to expect from the adults in their life. We know that behaviour is communication for our young people, and that's certainly how we frame it, that if students aren't sure what's going to be happening in the lesson or they're not sure what to expect from a particular teacher, that can sometimes then lead to behaviours escalating within the classroom or within the yard as well. So the behaviour categories help our staff to make sure that they can identify those behaviours and make sure that we can define them. And once we've defined those behaviours, then we can use the behaviour matrix. And as a couple of these are coming around, you can see what this looks like in context. So how we're going to be using this in schools is to identify 1 to 2 behaviour categories and then match it against the matrix. So for our students with disabilities, sometimes we will use their developmental age as opposed to their chronological age because that's where they're at. And that's one of the really handy parts of this. If we know that a young person's operating, between that 6 and 8 year-old range, that's the kind of strategies that we can expect to be able to use with those students that should be successful in supporting them in their behaviour at school. The really handy part for teachers is they can use this as a talking point with their leaders or with you as the family to go, the reason I'm saying this is that I'm concerned is that it's falling into this range, or the reason I think this is really serious is because this is where this information's coming from. So all of the information within this toolkit is based on science, on evidence-based practices, so that, again, we've got that consistency of approach across our schools as well. Or it might be that a teacher goes, I'm not sure for this young person where this is sitting, and going, actually that might actually be developmentally appropriate for a young person. So I'm going to monitor it, but I don't need to hit panic stations at this stage yet. So for teachers, it's really affirming as well so that they know where they're up to. So just to unpack what developmentally appropriate, concerning or serious might look like, I always use the example of a child with an anxious behaviour because that can, in our work as behaviour support coaches, that's one of the behaviours that comes up fairly regularly. And anxious behaviours can both be quite externalised, where they look like defiance or opposition, but they can also be really internalised behaviours that look like disengagement or students not connecting with their teacher or other students in their class. So anxious behaviours are ones that we work with fairly regularly. It's developmentally appropriate for a 12-year-old to avoid situations that they find stressful. Doesn't mean that we need to hit panic stations, doesn't mean that we need to go, we need to connect with CAMS immediately. That they might ask others to do things that they can do for themselves. A little bit of that learned helplessness because they're nervous, because they're 12. That's a developmentally appropriate behaviour for a 12-year-old. One thing that's been really useful with schools is to then unpack and go, well, if they're frequently asking for time out of class or they're going to the first aid room, wellbeing centre, going to another teacher's classroom, that's starting to indicate that maybe this is falling into that concerning range, and we might need to monitor this and put in some more targeted strategies to support that young person to manage their anxiety and to develop skills to manage it so that then it's decreasing. If a young person's then unable to engage in education on a consistent basis, they've got ongoing absences from schools, then we can start to look at going, this is actually in quite a serious situation, and this is where we might be talking about a referral to a GP or to a counsellor or a psychologist for that young person to have a health intervention to support the skills that they might need around their anxiety. So for all of those behaviour categories, we can map it out across developmentally appropriate, concerning and serious, so that way we've got some evidence in front of us on what that behaviour is, what that might look like depending on the child's age, and what that looks like whether it's developmentally appropriate, concerning or serious. Teachers can then go, okay, well, if it's developmentally appropriate, I'm going to be looking at my universal strategies. QDTP is what we call it in teaching, Quality Differentiated Teaching Practice. I do apologise, we love acronyms in education and we throw them out at parents like you always know what we're talking about. If we ever do that, please call us up on it, because I know that's something teachers probably need to work on. But we can start to look at what those universal strategies are in the classroom, in teaching practice and in our curriculum as well. If teachers can then go, yep, I feel like I'm doing all of those things that are linked to that behaviour, but I'm still seeing this as a behaviour of concern, then we can start to look at those targeted strategies in those 3 areas. Again, we want to make sure that the interventions we're doing with our young people are done with fidelity, and that they're being done consistently across their classroom, whether it's in an elective subject, so maybe your young person goes off to a different teacher for art or for science, or I'm seeing the kids out here playing with the chickens, maybe they have some kind of outdoor learning. That whatever our strategies in our teaching practice and in our classroom and in our curriculum are done consistently by the different teachers and SSOs that they're interacting with. And it also lets us support you and go, this is what we're doing and why. And like the OTs were saying, if we have that consistency between home and school, we can work together to develop the skills for the young people that we're working with. So
can I just say, if you look at these 3 kind of levels, I really like the cake analogy. So, the kind of layer cake. So your child shouldn't be having just the icing on the cake. They should get the other 2 layers underneath as well. It's not kind of a just pick one out of this. We want to layer from that universal or from that whole school, that whole class. Everyone can have access to this, all the way up to those really specialised interventions.
So we have done a few training videos to undertake with staff. How are we going for time? Do you want to skip
She just
through?
doesn't want you to see her face on it. We would love to see it, I think.
Fine.
See her last iteration of her other haircut.
Yeah. It's been a few since. No, we've got the special educator one, but I'm conscious that my video's up after this. That's right. We'll run through how the special educators are using them as well, just so that if you come to a parent meeting, the Behaviour Toolkit comes up, this might be something that schools present to you so that you've got some context on how this might work.
Question maybe you might still be giving to, or maybe it's best asked after the videos, but how does this play in with if the child has NDIS funding and they've got functional behaviour assessment can be quite a lengthy thing to have done over months and months and months and really expensive piece of funding. Are you saying that state funding is available for some students to get this free of charge, or?
So we look at the functional behaviour assessment in the context of the school environment and the classroom, whereas the NDIS one you're talking about would encompass those behaviours in the home and outside of school as well. So it's a bit different in that respect, but it has the same foundations and the same bones to it. It is where a school would have to do a referral to a behaviour support coach, and all our behaviour support coaches statewide have been trained in undertaking that. But again, it is that tier 3, so that top pointy end, where we're thinking that 3 to 5% of kids in our schools would access that. So it's a small percentage.
Will you work with children that are NDIS funded? I just know sometimes education and NDIS funding, departments do not want to and very rarely integrate together, so that's why I was asking.
So certainly my experience as a behaviour coach has been that when we have those team around the child meetings, if the NDIS providers are available, if that's how you guys want it. I know a lot of them charge to then come to those meetings, but we really welcome input.
Yeah, I understand that. I meant more so the funding stuff, but that's cool. That's answered my question. Thank you. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Was there another question as well? I just wondered, earlier on there was a term like positive behaviour support. I hear that bandied about in schools a lot. I just wondered what that actually means. Is that kind of using extrinsic rewards, which we kind of use?
Not necessarily. So the department's recently reformed their behaviour policy. Part of that was also reviewing how we use our suspension and exclusion procedures. And sometimes they can seem like contradictory terms of positive behaviour support and then still using suspension and exclusion. When we're talking about positive behaviour support, from the department's level, we look at 7 core functions of behaviour. What that involves is teachers promoting and modelling the behaviours we want young people to see, and a core part of those 7 core functions is teaching kids the behaviours. So when we talk about positive behaviour support, we mean identifying the behaviours that might be barriers to that young person engaging in education and teaching them the skills so that we don't get stuck in that cycle of suspension and exclusion or take homes, which can sometimes happen, unfortunately. In meeting with lots of parents, we know that is a parent experience. And so when we're talking about positive behaviour support, we're looking at how do we promote, how do we model, how do we review if students need to be retaught those skills if we have already taught them. So positive behaviour support can be a school-wide system of what their framework of behaviour support is. It can also be how we use resources like this to identify what the behaviours of concern are and how we teach those to young people in a developmentally appropriate way. Sometimes that can include reward systems, but depending on the kid, sometimes that's useful and sometimes that's not. So it depends on the kid as to, I suppose, how we do that positive behaviour support. But I think that the key takeaway is that we identify the behaviour skill that that young person needs, because skills can be taught, so let's teach them what we want them to be able to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just sort of saw it and I was worried that lots of behaviour charts and stuff like that.
And it does sometimes get confused with POSED, like positive education or positive psychology, and then there's lots of banners for it, so you might hear it being called PBL, so positive behaviour for learning. You might hear the term the MTSS, so the multi-tiered systems of support. There's lots of different, again, acronyms going around.
As we pass around those toolkits as well, they're not an exhaustive guide, they're a reference point, and that's part of the work of behaviour support coaches, is to then work with schools to unpack what those classroom or teaching practice or curriculum strategies might be. Thank you. So lots of the work that we've been working on with our schools is starting on those universal strategies, because we feel it's really important that that's done consistently and with fidelity across our schools before we move into those targeted or quite intensive strategies on the higher end of things. So depending on what the behaviour of concern is, we can start to look at what are our physical environment modifications that we might have in our classroom. We know for some young people, say they've got a break card, and often one of the things I hear from teachers is they've got a break card but they don't use it. And then they go from 0 to 100. In unpacking why some of the reasons that might be the case for some young people is if they're sitting here and the door's over there, they have to weave their way through the classroom, they feel embarrassed in front of all of their peers, they don't like having to show the teacher, they don't like acknowledging to their peers that they need a break, so they'll just sit there and hold it together until they can't anymore, and then to the teacher it looks like they go from 0 to 100. So some of the environmental modifications might be those kids that do need to have regular breaks, can we sit them somewhere that they feel more comfortable, whether that's near the door or near the teacher, so they can give each other a bit of a like, I've got to go look, or they can give the teacher the look and the teacher can say, oh, actually, I need you to take Miss Smith something next door. And it gives them that out so that they're not feeling like they're losing face in front of their peers. So our classroom's organised to allow children to participate, that we've got those quiet breakout spaces should they need that time to just go, oh, it's getting a bit much and I just need a moment. That seating's arranged purposefully depending on what the learning task is. And that's been one of the kind of aha moments for teachers, is if we're just sitting at desks all the time, does that support our students if we want them to collaborate and they're not sitting together, or we want them to work independently and they're surrounded by all of their peers, so that we're actually using where they're sitting in the classroom to support with the particular learning task that they're working on that day. That we've got a flow of traffic within the classroom. I know as a teacher myself, there's nothing worse than when you're shuffling through, sorry guys, and you're knocking the things off their table and then they're getting sidetracked, so that our classroom environment is a place that kids want to be and it feels comfortable. That our frequently accessed materials are there and available for our young people, so that they don't have to go, oh, I'm not sure what I need, or I don't know where that ruler is, and I don't want to admit that I forgot my charger today and my laptop's flat and I need that for my lesson. The teacher's going to tell me off, so I'll do this to get kicked out of class instead. So that we're considering all of those physical environmental adjustments on that universal level. And as I said before, that identified quiet or relaxed space, kids are around so many people all day. Sometimes they just need a moment to themselves, just so that they can support their own regulation. That's maybe where some of those OT strategies come in as well, going, right, I've been taught this regulation strategy, I can go to this place and do it, and then come back and be ready to learn and get on with things. Some of our other classroom strategies are around expectations and rules. In speaking with lots of young people, it's, oh, well, if I go to science, this is the rule, and if I go to art, this is the rule, and when I go to this subject, this is the rule. And that can create some anxiety because they might go, well, when I'm in this classroom, this works really well for me, but I don't have that available to me in another class, so I don't like to go. Or I'll do things in class that maybe we call behaviour, but quite often they're communicating that that classroom's not meeting their needs. We've been supporting schools to go, let's keep our classroom rules to about 3 to 5 rules. I have been in some classroom where there's a list of 20 classroom, you will not. But we want to make sure that kids can remember it, the teacher can remember it, and they're rules that help kids engage in learning and regulate their behaviour and have a positive classroom environment. And this is coming back to your question before about what is positive behaviour support, that rules are described and explicitly taught. One young man that I was working with who had a diagnosis of ASD did not like to do writing tasks, so we practice in his literacy block. This is our frequently accessed materials, here's what we get out, here's where we sit, here's what we do, and there's the expectation to do that writing task. And then he went to science and said, no, I just write in literacy, because we didn't practice it in different contexts, and that was learning for us as the teachers to go, we need to practice that in different contexts, because for him, that's how it works in his brain. And we did that, and it was quite successful. But it was one of those little moments of going, all right, you got me there. And again, having that consistency of routines and structures. Within primary schools, those routines and structures, you're with the same teacher for most of the day, it's a bit easier to implement. But even within high schools, we can have those routines and structures within the format of individual lessons. The entry routines are similar, the beginning of the lesson routines are similar, the middle of the lesson routines are similar, the exit from lesson is similar, so that we've still got that consistency across different subject areas, so it's predictable and can support our young people to engage in learning. When we talk about teaching practices, and again this is part of that positive behaviour support from the department, that we frequently acknowledge the behaviours we want to see. We pay attention to what we want. We say thank you for sitting down and getting your books out. I was really proud that you took a learning risk. I could see that you were a little bit nervous about that we acknowledge the behaviours that we want. There's active supervision, goes without saying within schools, but also looking at the rates of opportunities to respond, so that students aren't just sitting there, as you guys are. As I say this, the irony strikes me, that you have an opportunity to respond to what you're learning about, so that you're not just sitting there passively accepting, the wisdom of Katie and myself. And so when we support schools with positive behaviour support, we can actually identify rates of use, particularly for acknowledging desired behaviours, 4 positive to 1 corrective, and for opportunities to respond, we really want 3 opportunities to respond per minute after explicit teaching, but ideally somewhere between 4 and 10 per minute, so that kids are actively engaged in learning, that they're participants in learning. But again, for some students with additional needs, that might be too overwhelming, so it depends on the kid. Prompts, pre-corrections and corrections, that we're bookending, we call it, of we're doing this, in 10 minutes we're going to be finishing off, and then we'll be doing this, that we're giving kids that prompt of what's coming next, so that they're supported through those points of transition, because we know that that's quite often a tricky point for lots of young people.
So just in terms of transference, for you guys to support this sort of stuff at home, and really briefly said that 4 positives to the 1 correction, nearly got it the wrong way around, don't do it that way. So that is about providing not just like, I'm so proud of you or great job, that is that observable feedback to them, like Em mentioned. So I can see that you worked really hard, put in a lot of effort, and you finished your homework before it was due on Thursday. You should feel really proud, that kind of thing. 4 of those before you're actually providing a corrective response. And there is so much evidence to show that if we can load our kids up like that, the corrective response is going to be so much more powerful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that overlap between, saying thank you and praising, and that behaviour-specific praise, definitely. In terms of the universal strategies for curriculum, obviously, and I've just briefly mentioned a few of our key documents here, sometimes it's called ACARA, another acronym, our Australian curriculum, the Early Years Learning Framework, our Keeping Safe Child Protection curriculum that is a mandated curriculum that all young people have the right to have access to, and that's around behaviours that support social and emotional skills and student safety. That can be risk-taking, that can be managing friendships. There's a whole range, depending on the age of your child, of what that might involve, along with social and emotional learning. So things like self-awareness, managing your emotions, and part of that overlaps in the HPE or Health and PE curriculum, and part of that also overlaps in the child safe curriculum as well. We did want to give you an opportunity to respond, that if you had questions, that this was a bit of a forum that we could have that conversation as well. Hello.
Hi. How many behaviour support coaches are there in South Australia after education?
At the moment, our full-time equivalent is just over 40. I think there's 45, but that doesn't equate to the actual bodies once some people are part-time, but the actual full-time 1.0 positions is about 45.
And what's the process for getting a behaviour support coach to come into a school, and how long does it take?
So it's a little bit different for special ed and behaviour support, even though they're both teaching roles within our support services team. But the process is generally that the school has some sort of internal student review team process there. So quite often that might look like your wellbeing leader, perhaps a deputy, maybe a special ed coordinator, inclusive education coordinator at the site, and maybe the classroom teacher in that space having a discussion first, saying we've exhausted our kit bag, we've exhausted all the strategies that we've got, now we need some additional support. So they would then put in a referral, it can be over the phone or when they have their behaviour support coach out at their site, and they would put that in, and you'd have to give parent or carer consent for that to happen. In the behaviour space, it's quite rare that we would have a wait list. But in the special education space, when we hit the height of our special options placements and that kind of thing, there sometimes can be, because they have to be a priority.
You can also, if you're a parent, you can say to the school, we're aware there is a behaviour support coach. Do you think that maybe you would like to refer my young person to them and get some extra support? You're absolutely welcome to do that. Sometimes in our work with schools, a fair few students will come up at once, and we'll work with the school around prioritising the order that we provide support with, because obviously we don't just want to refer a kid and then they sit on our caseload if we don't have capacity to get there at that point in time either, because we want to be there for the students that are referred to us. So by all means, if you're a parent, request that of the school, so that's absolutely an option for you guys as well. No worries. Are there any other questions or anything that you would like clarified? No? Fantastic. Excellent. Lovely.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.